And for him, as for many English people until recent years, there was an equation. Unlike the situated gaze of the Scots, let alone the Irish, for them it was equivalent. And Enoch Powell said that a West Indian baby born in London, it doesn't make it English. So his political project of belonging was not being a British subject or part of the British Empire or even being born in England, but was determined by a racial origin. This was a very exclusionary political project of belonging, that you can become part of it only through descent. This has not been the only, at that time Enoch Powell was a member of the Conservative Party. He was expelled after his famous speech of Rivers of Blood, which predicted disaster if this rule is not going to be kept. And another political project is known famously as Norma Tebbit cricket test, which I'm sure many of you have heard. Norma Tebbit, a minister in Margaret Thatcher government, claimed that if people who go and watch international cricket games in which they applaud the team of the countries their parents came from, or even not necessarily their parents came from, like Pakistan or West Indies. I don't remember Diane Abbott very explicitly anti-Tebbit kind of claiming in Radio 4 that she clapped in favor of Trinidad, I think, or Jamaica. I can't remember. Some people here, you know.
Cricket team's West Indies.
Well, it was West Indian Java. Okay, thanks, Gandhi. Well, this political project of belonging, which determines the boundaries, not around racial descent, but around identification, loyalty, solidarity. If you are with us, even if you are from a different origin, the possibility of assimilation is there. Although, of course, in a racialized, stratified way, but this relates to the way we have to analyze this project, which I'll reach to in a moment. But in principle, you can belong. The New Labour, very famously by Blunkett and then Gordon Brown in his tour in Africa, presented an alternative political project of belonging or Britishness. One that at least David Cameron sounded as if he's imitating often. They were talking about British values. Interestingly enough, Blunkett, who wrote this famous white paper about a secure border, safe haven, claimed that British values are human rights. This was less than 2 years after the New Labour imported the legislation of human rights from Europe, and Blunkett himself suspended part of it after 9/11. But yet, in the construction of Britishness, of New Labour, this has been what Britishness is about. And we hear it also today: toleration, democracy, etc. Nobody who is not British really understands toleration, democracy, etc. So we can see that imaginary communities, as Anderson famously also imagined communities in terms of nation, not necessarily have to correspond in any way to common sense, minimal history or knowledge, but have to aspire and inspire sense of belonging. Now, of course, if you have common values, this is a much more permeable boundaries of the collectivity rather than dissent or being a citizen. However, interestingly enough, when Gordon Brown used this narrative in his African tour, he used it in an exclusionary way which did remind what happened during the empire, the civilizatory mission of the British to bring human rights, toleration, democracy, non-corruption to Africa, just like the British Empire did. And at that time, they were also muttering that one should not criticize the British Empire anymore because this is what it was all about. Now, another political project of belonging that had been dominant for quite a few years in Britain and other Western countries, especially Anglo-Saxon, has been what is known as multiculturalism. Now, some of us have been quite critical of multiculturalist policies because in some ways, especially in its early stages, it imported the technologies of control which have been used in the British Empire into British society. What was known as NCWP, New Commonwealth Countries and Pakistan, where at that time, almost the exclusionary or exclusive target of any policies and funds, and the different communities at which they were targeted, their boundaries were verified, their membership was homogenized as if all of them have the same attachments, identifications, values as other members of this community. I remember South of Black Sisters were told by the GLC that they cannot get money to Black Women Refuge because they're competing, those who competed with them to get this fund, which was some kind of a South Asian Muslim community, said, how can you give them the money? They're not real Asian girls, they don't even wear saris, they wear jeans. In other words, some of the assumptions behind multicultural policy in terms of its political project of belonging imported diversity and created a whole bureaucracy and professional middle class of members of those communities in order to control their integration into British society. However, there was one important difference, that this was a narrative of integration rather than assimilation. So although there have been a lot of problems about this reification and homogenization and the new imperial way of control, the principle that membership and belonging to the British collectivity in Britain itself does not necessarily have to be white. There is black in the Union Jack. Does not have to be hegemonically English, etc. With the years, with the changing nature of migration, as a result of neoliberal globalization, Britain's membership in the EU, especially after its expansion, more and more conflict and wars in the post-so-called Cold War period. The nature of migration to Britain changed, also, of course, because the legislation which allowed at the beginning for people from the ex-British Empire to come and allowed to settle changed in the 80s when the EU membership had been applied on Britain. also the reality of second and third generation from the post-World War II immigration to Britain, meant that these rigid boundaries between different so-called multicultural communities started to be considered as less rigid. There have been new groups, some of them very old, like the Irish and the Jews and the Roma, that have been admitted that they also are racialized groups and not just those from the ex-British Empire, and of course also other people from the South who were not necessarily part of the British Empire. So we are seeing a gradual change, which for some of us was seen as quite hopeful, as a transformative multicultural society. Then, after 9/11 and the age of securitization, and then New Labour, we see a transition of multiculturalist policies into a certain kind of bifurcation, which might seem to be a bit paradoxical. On the one hand, this was supposed to be the post-racial, post-ethnic, post-class, gender equality and so on age, and therefore the assimilatory drive has been reapplied from multiculturalism. On the other hand, we see the rise of multi-faithism. It is not only because Tony Blair, as well as American presidents, have been devoutly religious, but also in the age of not other differences have been legitimized. The only naturalized difference that was allowed to continue has been that of religion. This was, of course, also closely connected to the drive for securitization, in which, talking about political project of belonging, there have been attempts to differentiate between our Muslims and those horrible Muslims over there who have been bombing and have been killing and terrorists. The shock after 7/7 that some of those who put the explosives in the undergrounds and the buses were not only British citizens, but born and grew up here, educated here, even teachers here, was because of these naturalized borders of belonging, which equated citizenship, territory, nationalism with each other. While the political project of belonging of those who exploded was one not of national collectivity, but of religious collectivity, of the Ummah, in which when in the video of the bomber, he talks about my people. He didn't talk about the people in his town where he grew up in Britain. He talked about the Muslim people in the world as a whole. So this kind of trying to put a line in the sand between the good ones and the bad ones, this is a subject for another topic, but it does reflect a certain kind of change in the boundaries of belonging. From this, we come to the gradual development of this new technology of control of diversity and discourses of diversity, which we in our project call everyday bordering. What does it consist of? First of all, what it consists of is the fact that it is no more a question of being allowed to live here, being a citizen here, being born here. All these come under suspicion because citizenship status or having the right kind of papers to belong here supposed to be the dividing line, but in reality, because everybody is under suspicion that they are not, the rationalization, the suspicion, the lack of entitlement, you have to prove each time that you can legally live here, you can legally work with. When I like to tell the tale that when I was asked some months ago to be an external examiner in the University of London, I was forcefully reminded that I have to bring my passport to prove that I legally work in Britain, although I've been working legally in British universities since the 70s. But this pales in the fact that when the Institute of Education united with UCL, all members of the Institute of Education, not just like me who have a suspected accent, name, country of origin, but all of them had to produce proof that they are legal workers. In other words, everybody is under suspicion and they have to prove that they belong. And with the immigration legislation of 2014 and the forthcoming 2016, this is developing in all areas of life. Employment. Now, landlords have to check, photocopy, and keep the record to show that the tenants are legally in Britain. We have also, of course, those who are organizing marriages. It's part of their duty to check whether or not this is so-called sham marriages or not. Those who give driving license, those who are giving kind of bank accounts, those who are in education, everyone is becoming unpaid, untrained border guards who are given a new citizenship task to become a border guard and to check that none of us is a illegitimate border crosser. Of course, it undermines any kind of convivial pluralism, not only between the racialized and non-racialized, or between different kind of racialized communities, even within families. Because with the raids, and we produce a film, I don't know how many of you have seen, which we call Everyday Borders. The raids, for example, for restaurants, very often the so-called undocumented worker is the father-in-law of the Western worker. So it divides families as well as community. It creates, although this supposedly is to create security and part of the securitization drive, it creates sense of precarity for all of us. This is why we argue that this is a political project of belonging, not only a technology of control, because it caters to the rise in Britain, as well as in the rest of the West, of what we call autochtonic right wing. The autochtonic right wing are those who divide the society to those who belong and those who do not belong. And therefore, they claim that those who do not belong are taking over the jobs, are taking over the housing, the school, the welfare state. And this is why immigration, from a relatively apolitical question for some years, have returned and became much more reinforced, and now also not just immigration for the rest of the world, but also in relation to Brexit, in terms of the relationship in Europe this kind of sense that people are not, and societies are not anymore in control under globalization, and therefore they are going back to primordial attributes of belonging. And this discourse of everyday bordering is supposed to placate them and to show we have it under control. Don't worry. And unfortunately, this is now has become more and more the hegemonic political project of belonging, which definitely the conservative, let alone you, and big parts of labor as well, have been kind of co-opted into. And what does it say about the future of Britishness? Which kind of contestation? It's difficult to know. Because what is important, and I go back here, conclusion to my starting point, that the effects, my penultimate sentence, the effect of this political project of belonging are not the same to everyone. We should not homogenize them. The effect is different to racialized minorities who look as if they might be illegal migrants. Then, although it affects everybody, it affects some more than others. And also those who have money, who can buy their way to legal entry, or at least to the legal services of those who will facilitate their legal entry, is very different to those who do not have. Even to be able to get married, this kind of amount of money is important. It has gendered, class, racial effects, and we should never discuss this project without investigating the differential effect of them. And any kind of social change, I would argue, is through the lever of the way that this kind of project are not supposed to be to the benefit for everybody, although they sound as if they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nira. Were there just any points of clarification before we move on to Helena and Eric? We'll keep the discussion for afterwards.
I wonder, would you agree we've got to really oppose this notion of community cohesion? It's an attack on multiculturalism.
This is a discussion, this is not clarification.
Okay,
I promise to answer it in the discussion.
Oh,
yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so Eric Woods and Helen Kim are now going to present on the unresolved empire, art, identity, and the meaning of Britain's imperial past.
Okay, thanks everyone for attending today. Helen and I are very grateful for the opportunity to present this project, which is by and large still very much a work in progress. We're still in the process of collecting our data, but it's always wonderful to get a chance to put together a presentation and try to think through some problems early on in a project, rather than doing the kind of ipso facto thing that people generally do, which is present after it's all done. So we're very grateful for this opportunity. We look forward to lots of questions and points of clarification, which will hopefully clarify what's going on with all of our data as well. So thank you for being here, and thanks for hosting us, CMRP. So, without further ado, what are we doing today? Today, we're presenting a cultural sociology of the recent exhibition that's only recently closed at the Tate Britain called Artist and Empire. We're hopefully going to try to keep this to 30 minutes, and we kind of broke our presentation down to 4 broad points. We're going to begin with approach and methodology, then give a brief synopsis of the exhibition for those of you who weren't able to attend, a presentation of our data, and then we'll very briefly talk about some of the theoretical implications and some of the relevance we think might have emerged out of our data. And there is where we're still very much fuzzy, so lots of commentary that will be much appreciated. So, to begin then with our approach, just a very brief, very short review of the literature on public art galleries. Now, the conventional view for many years, most commonly associated with a woman named Carol Duncan, who's written beautiful works on the meaning of the Louvre, is that public art museums are endowed with a fairly clear meaning. There's a fairly clear function associated with public art museums. And that is that they are this site of ritual transformation. This is a route by which a state can transform a society into a nation. And it's also a way of exhibiting to international visitors the nation's greatness through art. And here, Duncan talks a lot about the Louvre, as I mentioned. So you go there as this kind of shapeless individual, in the case of the Louvre, this kind of unformed French individual, and upon moving through the museum, as you exit and as you encounter all these great national French works, you exit endowed with a sense of being French and getting a general narrative of what that means and the greatness of the artworks. And if you're an international visitor, you get a sense of, wow, look at these great treasures of this particular nation. So that's the kind of conventional view. Now recently this has been challenged in, over the past decade or so by others who question this transformational capacity. And they are those who focus on what happens in societies that are riven by ethnic and class and religious boundaries. And what about the possibility that curators themselves have different interpretive frameworks, and what if different groups have their own different interpretive frameworks? And that's kind of a setting off point for ourselves. So what is our approach and methodology? As I mentioned, our study of this exhibit, we focus on meaning. And this informs 2 linked questions that guide our study. The first question, what is the meaning of this exhibit? What is going on here? What is it all about? The second linked question is, what can this exhibit tell us about the status of empire in contemporary Britain? So that's a more kind of broader, more general question. So to resolve these questions, we should note that we're approaching them as sociologists rather than art critics. So this means we're not looking for some universal sense of meaning within the art object itself, or looking at solely the meaning that's projected from the art object. We see the projection of meaning as a relational process that also includes the visitors and the curators and anyone else associated with the art object or with the way in which the exhibit is curated. So that means we need to look for meaning in a variety of places. So how did we do this? We began with an ethnography of the exhibit itself and focused on how is this arranged, what type of objects are there. Then we went on to talk to the curators. There's a team of 3 curators responsible for staging the exhibit. And then we also started to talk to others who are involved in helping out with staging the exhibit. Then we went out and conducted 11 one-hour semi-structured interviews and focus groups with British visitors, and here we focus particularly on British visitors. And the way we gathered that data was basically standing outside the end of the exhibit and asking people if they want to talk about what they think about the exhibit. We took them for coffee and had a great conversation. Now we're focusing on discourse analysis of, we've gathered 20 reviews, but it looks like it's growing, of media commentators talking about it, whether in art journals or broadsheets. And that won't enter into this presentation because we're still very much in the midst of it. And all of this is taken particular inspiration from the cultural sociologist Anne Swidler, who wrote this beautiful book on Talk About Love. And she assumes that although meaning can be contested and it can come from various different actors who have different interpretive frameworks, so there could be meaning endowed in the object, there could be meaning from one particular visitor that's different from the other, the curator could associate a different meaning. But we don't assume that it's just a kind of cacophony of meanings and there's no clear-cut patterns or narratives that can emerge. So our view is that by looking at all this, some common themes might emerge. And that's our cultural sociological approach to this. So, what was this exhibit? Maybe I should turn.
Sure, yeah, okay, I'm just gonna jump in and give you guys a quick description of the exhibit itself, for those of you who hadn't seen it, and even for those of you who have. The idea behind the exhibit, which was actually relatively small, it was a thematic exhibit. It was intended to showcase specifically British art and the British collection here of imperial art. It was the first of its kind for Tate Britain. Okay, so not to say that that there weren't exhibits elsewhere that were done on this particular subject or linking art and empire, but specifically at Tate Britain, it was apparently the first of its kind. And just for those who don't know, and again, even for those who do, Tate Britain has the most comprehensive collection of British art of its kind. Notably, the Yale Center for British Art is the only other institution or center that has a kind of comparable collection. And it has the largest collection of Turner's work, who, in fact, Turner bequeathed the work to Tate Britain. So again, as I mentioned, it was a thematic exhibit rather than an exhibit that only kind of concentrated on a particular artist. There were 6 rooms, okay, which I will then describe in the next slides. The 3 curators, that's Alison Smith, she's a lead curator, David Bailey Brown, and we have a third, Gus Casely Hayford, okay, not Carol. Okay, it was in total, it did actually take 5 years to put together. And was really kind of divisive, as I will talk about, or as we will talk about in some of the later slides. And actually prior to the exhibit, or previous to the exhibit, there was a 2-day conference. From what we understand, it was a 2-day conference that was more academic, that was held before the actual exhibit was put on. Okay. So again, yes, it was a collection really of, it was a mix really of historical and contemporary paintings, objects, artifacts, and sculpture from the 16th century onwards. And the large range of objects, as I've mentioned before, were strictly from collections across Britain, and included things like maps, flags, paintings, photographs, sculptures, and again, as I said, artifacts. So the first room, mapping and marking, was called that because it really kind of was the room that contained various maps of the empire at different historical points, of different parts of the empire, North America, Europe, notably Ireland, parts of Africa, Oceania, and Asia. There also were, interestingly, these Ghanaian Asafo flags that were also part of this particular room, included here as symbolic maps of resistance, or also can be seen as, or read as radical object. So that's room 1. Room 2 was called, so it's probably kind of self-explanatory, but the rooms were also titled. So room 1 was called Mapping and Marking, room 2 was called Trophies of Empire. As you can imagine, it explores objects that were collected from discovery voyages, from conquest, from scientific endeavors, etc. And it contains artifacts and natural history that were collected by soldiers, sailors, explorers, missionaries, and traders. And so this picture here is the kind of, I would say, the focal point, or one of the highlights of that particular room. And it was George Stubbs' painting entitled A Cheetah with a Stag and 2 Indian Attendants. And George Stubbs is the leading British animal painter and was the artist of record for animals arriving in menageries and research collections from the colonies or from discovery voyages during the Henry period. Okay, room 3, entitled Imperial Heroics. Here the Tate was exploring historical paintings that served as, quote, documentary forms of portraiture, typography, and genre that were, quote, intimate and powerful means of addressing the nation. this we got directly from the catalog. So here, this image is Lady Butler, Elizabeth Butler's painting the remnants of an army in Jalalabad. And that was, again, one of the sort of highlights of the painting, of the room. And here, this is, I guess I included it to kind of show how it interestingly is, of course, it's depicting a wounded soldier, holding on to his, desperately holding on to his saddle so as not to kind of collapse from exhaustion. And Lady Butler actually was an artist who depicted the experiences of ordinary soldiers, involved in British colonial wars, and she was a noted anti-imperialist, and her paintings actually served to kind of critique these wars through these sort of everyday depictions. Yes, interestingly, that was not actually labeled as such, but we'll talk more about that later. But that's one of the highlights of that room. Room 4 was called Power Dressing, and here they explore this idea of grand manner portraiture. In other words, these kind of full-size portraits that, quote, reinforce the presence, power, and authority of the colonizer. And like a kind of subset of this power dressing room were these, what they call British cultural cross-dressers, right, who kind of wore these sort of hybrid concoctions, or assemblages, sorry, of outfits. Yes. Room 5 was called Face to Face, and here it kind of explored, the Tate explores the transnational exchanges of people under the British Empire, depicted visually. And here, these representations were also, these face-to-face encounters, or representations of face-to-face encounters, where they're also, and exploring the kind of adoption of particular East and Eastern, Western, the synthesis of painting traditions or artistic traditions. And this painting here is a depiction of Pocahontas. So, yeah. Okay, we'll leave that. And the final room here is called Out of Empire, and it explores the transnational sort of forms of modern art in the British Empire in the 20th and 21st centuries. And here is where you have sort of a real mix of the kind of historical and contemporary art and commentary of artists, engaging with sort of older works of empire, and creating newer works that sort of challenge these sort of older views of history, of representations, and of myths, and myth-making of the empire. And of note is Andrew Gilbert's work here, actually, it escapes me this. Yeah. Okay. If you want to know, we can give that to you later. But here again, the kind of juxtaposition of sort of older works and newer works there in the kind of commentary on some of these older narratives.
Okay, so we've kind of made our way through the exhibit in our exploration of what the heck does this all mean, what's going on here. And the first stage was, okay, what does this mean for us? We walked through it, the two of us together, and sat down and had a coffee and looked at the exhibits, looked at other people looking at the exhibits themselves, and wondered what is happening here. And the really two big things that come out for us is confusing and ambivalent. We found it to be slightly hard to understand what's going on, and the meanings when they were there were quite ambivalent. So why did we find it confusing? In the first case, we noted that there was no introduction whatsoever to the exhibit, no kind of introductory on some kind of context on what was the British Empire, if we knew nothing about it, why artworks might have been, or it was arranged in a particular way. And then as you move through it, this kind of goes on. So it's not just no introduction of the sequence, but as you go into the rooms, there's no explanation for why certain artworks are placed beside one another, and so on and so forth. Why did we find it to be ambivalent? we were always not sure how we should feel about the objects. One reason is that the explanations of the artworks often did not seem to fit how they were presented. So oftentimes you would have an artwork which you weren't sure, should this be perceived as an object of beauty? How should I feel about it? It looks very interesting, and then maybe the explanation beside the painting or the sculpture would give a kind of different perception or presentation of the way it was. And this also led to a lack of clarity of how we should feel about the rooms altogether. For example, in the trophy room, which Helen just talked about, it was very unclear how we should feel as visitors. The way they set it up was in a way very similar to the way it would have initially been set up, with adventurers and empire bringing back trophies and putting them in a room, and in a kind of quasi-anthropological fashion of look at the way the natives in empire produce art. And in fact, that's the way most people in the rooms seem to perceive the objects. So we're not sure if this is a presentation with some kind of interpretive framework of being ironic or wondering how it was in the past, or in fact this was just kind of dusting off some old objects and saying, look, we haven't presented this in a long time. And it was similar with the heroics room as well, where very much so in the room it's showing paintings that's presenting a kind of way in which empire was used as a kind of propaganda tool for showing that empire was something to be proud of. And in fact, some of the write-ups would mention that. But in fact, as you walk through the room, a part of it is just the grandeur of these great paintings. So you're again kind of hit with this ambivalence between the write-up and the painting itself. Another thing we found that, perhaps because of the lack of introduction, and perhaps because of the way it was curated and sequentially arranged, we found empire to seem very insignificant and very parochial, just as a kind of another minor historical moment of which many people today are bequeathed of their particular group having once had an empire. It seemed just a kind of particularly relatively small British endeavor that happened some years ago. And we found this in particular in the power dressing room, where all of the write-ups in the introduction to that room stressed that it was a time of mixing, hybridity, and the way that the paintings were presented almost as curios. Look at these kind of silly men who are dressing up in strange clothes without getting a sense of an empire that in fact was of world historical importance and in fact has cultural legacies in the way in which behave, think, and dress across the world today. So we found that to be strangely missing. We found the narrative itself, the narrative thread that runs through the sequence, to be also kind of confusing. We note that there was no artworks on the loss of empire. You just go straight to Out of Empire, which deals with legacies. And we also note that there's this kind of flip that goes on throughout the exhibit, where there's a kind of, goes from a focus on European art to the last room, the legacies room, being on formerly colonized people's art, which we wondered, was this intentional? Were there no white British who were also dealing with the legacies of empire? Why is the reason for the flip? Another reason that we found it to be kind of confusing. So that's generally our impressions. Slightly befuddled, confusing, ambivalent, and we're really not sure how should we feel? What is the meaning of this exhibit? So we thought, okay, now it's the time to go ask the curators. What were they trying to do with this? And I'll leave the floor to.
So as I mentioned, the three lead curators here, in interviewing them and asking them about how this exhibit came about, as I mentioned earlier, or as we mentioned earlier, we were saying that this was a kind of difficult exhibit to put on, which probably isn't that surprising. But I think what surprised us was, how they were very willing to kind of talk about how difficult it was, even before it actually was put on, right? So when I had mentioned this 2-day conference, Gus Casely Hayford, sorry, the print is tiny, I'm trying to cram all of these interesting things into one slide. Gus Casely Hayford says, there's a conference before the exhibit and we were so surprised by the feedback and people's reactions. People at the conference were so critical of the Tate and what we were trying to do. This was a very tense period and we thought, oof, this is going to be really tough to do this exhibit. It might be impossible. Yeah, so he does kind of go on about how it really kind of didn't set a very good, he wasn't very optimistic about whether or not this exhibit would actually be able to go on. And Gus Hayford sat on the board of the Tate exhibit, Tate Britain as well, and talked about how the board members were also very divided about the possibility of this putting on such an exhibit. Partly because, or mainly because it all kind of very much implicated the Tate's own history and the institution itself into this exhibit, in terms of its holdings, in terms of its own sort of role in expanding or legitimizing empire, and, so that was definitely something that was talked about. David Brown, another curator, talked about the fact that there was a lot of internal debate, particularly amongst the curators within the exhibit. So he talks about how there were a lot of assumptions and preconceptions that were made about people, and especially over people's intentions, curators' intentions, and fighting against those was very difficult. And there he says it's about fighting these internally. And then talks about the fact that actually the audience, of course, or rather, sorry, reviews and visitors' reactions to that also reflected these, seem to reflect these kind of internal divisions as well. So these were very fragmented. Even the reviews, some of the reviews, they were both very extreme. Either people loved it or they hated it. And Alison Smith here talks again about the fact that actually this was an exhibit that did take 5 years. It took a very, very long time. I guess I want to draw attention to the fact that she's saying in that very first sentence, we thought it was perhaps not the right time to do this. And so it was a very tentative thing, I think. That's something that, again, seems to kind of come out in these interviews. How tentatively, how even just, how do I put this? How softly the Tate decided to tread on this exhibit, and on their opinions, or rather their views on this, and the curators themselves. And actually, Alison Smith talks about the new director, who has since left, but the new director at the time, Penelope Curtis, who came into the Tate at 2010 as a director, and how it was through her leadership that actually precipitated, or that allowed for this exhibit to come forth. And so what that led to was this kind of view by the curators, or the kind of voice of the curators, or the way in which they set up the kind of narrative of this exhibit, to not be didactic, to, in a sense, and I'm quoting them, to kind of impart this view of neutrality or impartiality, right? So Alison Smith saying, we don't want to be didactic, we didn't want to be didactic, we wanted to bring people into the exhibit, allow them to bring their own experiences and memories. And again, as I mentioned, Penelope Curtis, the director, the then director of the Tate, she was quoted as saying, she wanted to show the collection more aesthetically, sometimes with less information, thus allowing the art to speak for itself. And I think that definitely comes through, again, in terms of the way in which the curators discussed their sort of way of presenting the work in this exhibit. And David Brown says it kind of in a longer way, saying it's not so much about ambivalence, but about neutrality. You can't apply the same value judgments to art. You can't make absolute judgments about these things. So we want it to be neutral overall. But, yeah. Oh, okay, all right. And just to kind of bring it now to some of the work that we've done on visitors. The curators also had a very, detailed, very specific view of the audience and of who would come to see the exhibit, and of course who would come to see exhibits just in general at the Tate, particularly this one. And so we have David Brown talking about this core audience at the Tate Britain, more often than not, white, quite often outside London, and yes, who generally prefer, I guess, less thematic exhibits. But, okay, just
Okay.
right on to
Very
this.
quickly to the visitors' views, I note that we're kind of dragging on too much at the outset of this presentation. So, very quickly, I'll just say that here's our kind of some shared themes. There was also a feeling of confusion as to how they should interpret the exhibit. Feeling amongst most visitors was that the exhibit was muddled or missing something, and many questioned why there was not an introduction, such as ourselves. Discussion of the exhibit itself and the broader topic of empire was almost always collapsed in their answers. It was basically impossible to keep it conceptually separate when we were talking with them. And also of note was the response was always highly, highly emotional. You just kind of needed to ask, not even begin your question, and people wanted to talk and talk and talk and talk and become quite emotional. Visitors tended to gravitate towards the maps and portraits of plants, and the reason given was that this was somehow more scientific, and it was kind of the adventurer or curious phase of empire building. The artworks by colonized peoples was well liked, and a common expression was that they would have liked to see more of those. So they did kind of take a kind of quasi-anthropological, curio look at those. Generally, the heroics room was not very well liked, and the most common reason given in this regard was that they had seen those kinds of paintings in other settings. So there was also, amongst everyone we talked to, this kind of binary opposition between them. Always two opposing views, which seemed to line up according to several shared narratives and patterns. So, position one was, exhibit is too negative about empire. And these respondents, they seemed primed to dislike the exhibit even before visiting. And they would give views that, well, I know that Tate Britain is a kind of, everyone on the board favors Jeremy Corbyn. We know what this place is like and what they're going to do. Then they felt that the Tate was also guilty of using present-day sense morality to judge the past. And in that regard, they often focused upon the explanations of paintings, which they said were particularly guilty of this approach. They said, here's the curators trying to impose a present-day interpretation. And then they would, very often, you couldn't keep them on the topic of the exhibit and get into a general discussion of empire. And they would talk about why empire should be a source of pride. And they would mention, invariably, the railroads. And they would also juxtapose what they felt was generally a beneficent approach to empire against other European empires, such as French, the Spanish, and the Belgians. And one respondent who was going on in that would also ask the question of what would have been the case if Germans had run our empire, thus implying that it would have been much, much worse than their own empire. So position two is this exhibit is too positive about empire. The general feeling was that the exhibit did not go far enough to reveal the exploitative side of empire, and particularly they again focused on the explanations, saying that they were far too neutral or positive. They wondered why there were not more artworks critical of empire. One respondent mentioning that there was a long-running historical critique of empire within Britain itself, and many painters, even someone such as Turner with his famous slave painting, why was that not included, they asked. One respondent was particularly critical of the power dressing room, arguing that it was suggested that empire was a place of blending and mixing rather than exploitation and subjugation. And respondents tended to then generally argue about empire and why it's something we should not be proud of, mentioning mass killings throughout the empire. So, very quickly then, implications. What does this all mean? And we kind of went at this at three different levels. So, what is the meaning of this exhibit after all is said and done? Well, as we found amongst talking to curators, thinking about it ourselves, and talking to respondents, it's very ambivalent, not only in how empire should be interpreted, but specifically as to whether empire should be something to take pride in or be shameful about it. This ambivalence runs to the objects themselves, and is often unclear whether the object should be admired as a source of beauty or whether it should make the viewer uncomfortable. Implication 2, what does this say about the significance of empire today, if we can make a more bolder claim there? What we found is that it is very unresolved. As we found, there's this binary opposition running through all of our respondents, and it's very emotional, almost to the point of explosive, in that it doesn't take very much to argue about. And as we were just, as sociologists, we thought, oh, we're onto something, because you just gently prod and they want to answer. And it didn't take anything to say, would you like to talk about the exhibit? And they would go, and somehow it was just trying to dive in as they're going on and on about empire to kind of keep them onto a question. So it's deeply emotional, very unresolved, and almost explosive. And so that seems to point in the direction of perhaps what Paul Gilroy is talking about with regard to post-colonial melancholia might have some traction in that regard. And we'll talk about that later in the conversation. And also what is referred to as a trauma of perpetrators, which I've written on a little bit about, might also have some traction here as well, in the sense of an object of potential shame that's very much unresolved and just almost barely lying below the surface, or perhaps not even below the surface. And implication 3, a kind of higher range of theory, is what does this tell us in terms of the staging of national exhibits on contested topics in complex and divided societies? Well, as we found here, it was very much not transformational. Oftentimes, people's interpretive frameworks that they came to the exhibit already, it was kind of merely confirmed and made them quite agitated and emotional, depending on what side it was on this kind of binary opposition. But just to kind of conclude on that note, was we've got to thinking that that's not to say that perhaps transformation is not possible. So we'll maybe end on a more optimistic note, because we did find that among all the focus groups, they were so thankful for the opportunity to talk and work through their thoughts on empire and the exhibit itself. And that gets us thinking that maybe there are other ways of staging difficult paths which can kind of induce a more sharing and working through approach. And if you want to have, okay, so that's what we have so far.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for presenting that when it's very much in process. I'm really looking forward to the next bit. So we'll move on quickly to Gardner Bhattacharya's presentation, which is entitled Disentitlement and the Shifting Boundaries of National Belonging.
Okay, already 3 seems too many to me, and I'm the one speaking, so let me try desperately to make this not as long-winded as it was going to be. You have to read this, it's just prompts for me. I've been trying to think about a time when something like the terms of national belonging are in flux, not the terms of national belonging in terms of cultural resonance or even identity, but something else about what it feels like to belong. I do understand, as both the previous papers really reference, that there is a very strong popular understanding that still references blood and heritage, but inevitably, and this is also kind of referenced in both previous papers, the kinds of population who now live in Britain mean that we are knowingly diverse populations. So we might speak about Britishness as if there is an echo of blood and heritage, and really it's not, because you can't live in urban Britain and believe the blood and stock idea. And alongside all of that remaking of everyday common sense about what a kind of heritage belonging might be, there's a very rapid remaking of the terms of entitlement in our time. And I've been trying to work around ideas of entitlement and disentitlement. And so this is really just some talking points about how that debate might map onto our ideas about national belonging. Because those ideas about entitlement, of course, are not framed explicitly in any way as matters of national belonging. It's about resources, fairness, the budget, and yet. So let's talk about the and yet. For a few years, with still not much conclusion, I've been trying to think about the idea of disentitlement, which is a very old understanding, which has come back a lot in ways in which people are working around austerity. So disentitlement is this very active technique to ration, differentiate and curtail access mainly to public goods, and it might be material resources, but it might be something like rights or a bigger kind of access. I think, although not everybody would say this, that it's very importantly enacted through practices, sometimes informal practices, and might not necessarily be a matter of policy proper. Some of that echoes what Neera was saying about everyday bordering, that the formal policy says this is what it is to be documented and this is what it is to be undocumented, and we know the difference. The informal practice, as Neera has described, and the film from the project really describes in even more scary detail, is a great deal of differentiation about who has what and who can enter what, a sifting of populations. However, whether it's formal or informal, the process of being positioned as disentitled, which isn't a proper word, but you have to bear with me, reshapes relations to the state and the possibilities of political voice. There's something about that sifting that makes you differently, makes us all differently. So it might be something like a process which over time teaches people to mute their demands or to kind of put their demands differently. Or it might be a way of playing along in bad faith. So you learn a bureaucratic process that differentiates you, but you learn how to position yourself within it. And I think work, not from Britain, but from more explicitly authoritarian spaces, talks about that, about what it is to inhabit the very intrusive rules of public life, which everyone knows are not fair, but you can't tell where you'll be positioned. And it also might school you to develop tactics to win in an unjust system. But it might be all of these. I was thinking, I'm already going too slowly, but I was thinking of an example around schooling. I'm 47, nearly 48. I was schooled in this country. In the 70s, pretty much, people just went to their local school. And there wasn't even a kind of discussion. There was no news story about the day when people get their school places. That's kind of, when did that start happening? Now, in a kind of moment of engineered crisis in state schooling, this whole idea of how it is to get into a school, what kind of school, where is that school, what will happen in that school, becomes this whole kind of lottery. And it's a unjust lottery in which some people think, okay, I know I cannot be fairly or properly dealt with. There's no good faith way of getting my child a good schooling. So either I learn bad faith or tactics, this is what the middle classes are doing, suddenly, even a good friend of mine, suddenly, oh, miraculously, now we're Catholic again. You know, you're seeing that all across urban spaces of London. Or you kind of mute your demands, because, and I think you can see that as well, you understand that the class position I'm in means that there's no demand for schooling for us. And I think that's almost open in Britain today. Right. But I must try and be more quick than that, because if I explain everything so much, right. Disentitlement, of course, is not a break from an understanding process of exclusion. It is, I think, a central element of dismantling welfare settlements, and in a variety of locations, although I know Britain really best of all. But of course, it's always shaped by longer local histories. It sits on top of that longer standing processes of exclusion. Schooling, even when people went to their local school, still excluded loads of African Caribbean boys, still didn't school working class young people properly, but it had a different rhetoric around universal access. Now something different is happening about the differentiation. So the point I think is really worth noting about this thing called disentitlement is it's about taking away access and rights that you might previously or quite recently or recent generations might have thought of as relatively secure, a very active dismantling. You have this, I'm disentitling you, it's a taking away. That's quite a particular deal, I think. Or you might think of that as a shift in the terms of belonging in such a way that responsibility shifts away from the state to provide and towards the individual to prove that they are deserving. Whereas once we have a version of a welfare settlement for all its flaws, in which the responsibility of the state is to give, if you are in the room of the entitled, now, whoever you are, it is always your responsibility to demonstrate, perform entitlement in different ways. And I'll try and say a little bit about what those things are. This comes from a bigger piece of work I'm doing, but just a reminder to myself. Saskia Sassen's quite recent book about expulsions, one of the key kind of summary points she makes is the move from Keynesianism to the global era of privatisations, deregulation, open borders for some, and she thinks that's now, even though she says entailed a switch from the dynamics that brought people in to dynamics that push people out. So whereas those of us who've lived in places such as Britain with something like a semi-functioning welfare settlement lived through different machineries which were designed to incorporate, come into work, come into training, come into citizenship, learn to belong, all those terrible years when Blair and Brown used to have endless debates about what it is to be British, how can we persuade everyone to be British. That's not now. Now it's not come in. You're never going to belong, out you go. You're never going to be productive, out you go. You're never going to pass, into detention you go. Spitting out. So, she's saying we've moved from a period from incorporating greater numbers to a period of expelling in greater numbers. I have a whole other interest, which Malcolm is unlucky enough to have to listen to soon, about surplus populations, but there's not time to do that now. But there is a bigger debate floating around the whole discipline in the world about what is it to make more and more people surplus to requirement in different ways. Now, alongside that idea that we're in a moment where we're being more and more under threat of being spat out rather than incorporated in, there's an older literature, and this is from Reagan-Thatcher time. Michael Lipsey writes this article which I love, but it's from 1984, so it's ages old, and it's about that Reaganite moment when he's saying there's been a long period of pushing the poor out of social programs in the States, which he says is a softening up, and the moment of Reagan really hardens that. And he calls it bureaucratic disentitlement. And he says it's this bit on this side is his little summary of it. It's the mode of fiscal and programmatic retrenchment that takes place through obscure and routine actions of public authorities. So he's saying it's not when the powerful stand in the middle of the room and say, we hate all of you, you're not getting anything anymore. It's all of those moments in the little offices, in the corridors, in the border checks, in the bureaucracy in which you don't quite count, these papers are not quite right, come back tomorrow, come back next week, come back next year, come back never. All of those ways, which again echo so much what Nira was saying about everyday bordering, but go far beyond the border, because they infiltrate many other arenas of public policy. So it's so sad, it still makes me cry when I say it. Wake up now. We all know it's horrible. You all know it's horrible, you don't need to see it. You don't have to read this quote, I'll tell you what he's saying. The point about bureaucratic disentitlement is that the arenas of contestation move away from you, because it happens in the bureaucracy, not in the political arena. There is not an easy way of having a political voice against it, because it is just the rules. When you stand in the housing office week after week, and there's never enough to go around and just bring the right paper, it is not the same as someone over here saying, do you know what, poor people in Lambeth will never be housed. In which case we go and protest and say, yes, they will be housed, no, they won't be housed. It's not an explicit politics. It's a mundane, bureaucratised politics where it's not quite clear at what point the decision is made that always has the outcome that the poor do not get what they need. That's what he's saying, and he says, and it both disenfranchises, exploits, expropriates, but mutes political voice, because the places where you might argue, who are you arguing with? Is it this housing officer who is so rubbish again and says, I'm just doing my job, it's all I have to give you? but the where else it is not available. That, I think, is very, very interesting as a whole way of thinking about how expropriation happens. Oh, already halfway through, more longer. Okay. What does national belonging feel like? Now, we know that the anti-migrant discourses of our time return again and again to ideas of resource allocation. That's why we must hate the migrants, not because we're racist, but because there's no room in the schools or no room in the hospitals. Within that, I think there is increasingly a quite explicit implication that, I don't know if you can have an explicit implication, an explicit assertion perhaps, that access to public resources is an entitlement of national belonging. I should get this because I belong here, but you do not, and so you shouldn't. It's pretty much as open as that, isn't it? Of course, that's never been the case. We know everyone who's been here has not had access to those things. But in a time when the terms of nationhood based on blood and stock seems uncertain, and less tenable for many, many people, including those who might claim versions of exclusionary identities, because even UKIP don't think that blood and stock means you are here and they're there. So even the racist parties of our time kind of not in that same story as even from the 80s you had. Entitlement to the shared goods of nation becomes a central claim of belonging. That's what it means. I deserve this, you don't. That's because I belong and you don't. Right, calm down, otherwise I'm not going. So, the move from bloodstock style belonging to entitlement resources style belonging reveals the tension between being entitled, like a state of being, and demonstrating entitlement. One is something kind of in my body, just my being. One is I have to do it all the time to show you I'm doing it. So even though we might have those naturalised ideas of national belonging floating around, sometimes even referencing imperial history in just the way that Helen and Eric said, and even if we have those kinds of lovely landscaping things, whenever you see the Scots Nat kind of debate, the landscape is still there. In the day-to-day, belonging is much more, I think, shaped around or spoken around these ideas: public service, resources, entitlement. And that remaking of public services has shown a real shift in the relations between state and citizenry that demands much, much more than naturalised being to demonstrate entitlement. In the most horrible of ways, and the racist party say this, being white is not enough. And I don't mean being white because you might be Polish, it's just there's no racial category which will guarantee your entitlement in this new model. Because entitlement here is linked ostensibly to actions, and it's something that must be constantly reaffirmed through such actions. You've never finished the test of showing your entitlement. We must all prove that we deserve, endlessly till death. Right, so I'm going to say 3 examples, I'm going to say what I think about it. I almost don't need to say it. The National Health Service is reclaimed as this popular symbol of national consciousness as an alternative symbol, both the Olympic opening ceremony, that strange Christmas #1 from last year that no one ever heard but everyone bought. That's the kind of sign of, oh look, this is what good nationalism means. We also know that both the public media reports and, I have to say, when I was doing a bit of research, all the policy reports within the system are very actively talking about rationing in different ways. Rationing around health services used to be an accusation that the popular press put towards the health service. It's actually a big policy debate now. What would be a reasonable form of rationing that the public could live with? If you, because I was doing this, I was looking at different health managers' newsletters, and they're looking at how can, for a rationing system to work, the public have to buy into it. So which would be the one? Not how we avoid rationing, alongside a very pervasive sense of scarcity, exacerbated by the kinds of industrial disputes going on across the health service. This comes after a generation of restructuring health providers. People who've lived in this country for 20 years will know what the primary healthcare trusts, what kind of carnage it was to create them and now dismantle them again, all of which accelerated by a recent period of austerity. So I just, you just need to know that this symbol of national belonging feels like it's slipping through people's fingers. I'm not going to show you the website, because it's just to see the graphs. Benefit sanctions in this country, it tells you the definition, but if you're on job seekers allowance and also if you're on, employment and support, it's the one that now people with disabilities and long-term illness have, you might be subject to a sanctions regime. Sanctions regime means that in order to get your benefit, you must be constantly showing yourself to be available for work, engaging in certain practices, coming to your appointments on time, doing this, that and the other, showing your entitlement all the time. And if they sanction you, there are different levels, but basically they stop your money. It can be for a long time. You can appeal, but then you still won't have money. Right, so that's your ostensible reason. Many of you might have read this, because this next bit is just out of paper. But here are some of the circumstances in which such sanctions, which leave people with no income, with no money for 4, 8, 12, 13 weeks. And these are all examples from people who are clients of the Trussell Trust, which is the largest network of food banks in the country, run through the Anglican Church, I think, or one wing of the Anglican Church. Okay, you could read this, I'll read some of them out. A man who missed his appointment due to being hostile with his partner, who had just had a stillborn child, still sanctioned. A man sanctioned for missing an appointment to the job centre on the day of his brother's unexpected death. Tried to phone, could not get through and left a message which was constantly not relayed to the appropriate person. Still sanctioned, no money. Come back from burying your brother, no money. 60 job searches but missed one that matched his profile, sanction. Had an appointment on Tuesday, suspected heart attack that day, missed the appointment, sanctioned for 9 weeks. Just had a heart attack, 2 months without money. Secured employment was due to start in 3 weeks, but sanctioned because you still have to be available for work. Right, all these things, as you can see, they combine aspects of what Liskey describes as bureaucratic disentitlement with that kind of sense of expulsion that Sasson is talking about. You don't have to, they're the same horrible examples, you don't have to read them now. And alongside that, a whole crisis around disability benefits, with more and more testing for that, so you're never free. This is just to tell you what. The reasons why there have been kind of a lot of complaints about the testing regime for people on what they've made disability benefit, which is ESA, is that lots of people, half the people win their appeals, but they've still been in this difficult position. They might be put on job seekers allowance, which opens them to this different sanctions regime, even if they're quite ill or disabled. And it makes people worse, especially people with mental illness. Right. Last 2 things. All of this, I think, indicates something about a shifting boundary of belonging. The day-to-day practices of resource allocation reconfirm the shifting boundaries of belonging, because it feels like you're always being tested. Most of the time, I think now, nation doesn't really serve as a framework to bind together different classes. Not here today, it might have done previously. And where popular nationalism is articulated, such as during the Brexit campaign or by UKIP, it's often alongside an expression of anti-politics, that this is they're all as bad as each other, and explicit distrust of elites in the political class. The whole process of disentitlement, which is seeping into more and more arenas, suggests that all belonging may become conditional, and I think that's a big consciousness change for our time. I do think that the popular debate around sovereignty and immigration and Europe includes a desire to reclaim unconditional belonging for some, but I don't think the techniques of expulsion and disentitlement will be curtailed by the kinds of nationalist measures that are being proposed, because they're a different set of measures for a different logic, different motivation. So we're in a moment where those terms of national belonging are in a kind of battle around the application of disentitlement. Yet at the same time, I'd want to say, and I don't know if the others would agree, that I don't think right now that appeal to shared national belonging and entitlement is very central to elite discourse. Now and then, but that's not, they might say we're all in together now and then, but that's not the main thing they're saying. And on the other side, the battles over entitlement are often framed as anti-elite critiques. So when people say, I belong, we all belong, they mean, but those Eton boys all of those politicians, they're the enemy. So even though the political classes continue to reference earlier modes of nationalist narrative when it suits them, even them saying that, the moments when Cameron says the kind of let's hug kind of moments, that in itself can ignite further resentment from those living with the disciplines of disentitlement. That, you know, anything that's said to say, oh look, binding together, because of these fractures in everyday life, it kind of feeds the other side, it feeds the anti-politics people. So I'm just kind of interested at the moment about what happens when a whole range of popular movements, from all parts of the political spectrum, I think, accuse the elite of abandoning the nation, whereas previously, and certainly the middle paper, about a time when the nation is a technique of the elite. So, rush. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Georgie. Could all of the speakers come and sit round the table? I think we need to bring the chairs. Sorry?
Community cohesion
Yes.
will have to go, unfortunately.
There are many actually there.
Oh, there's one, yeah, there's one in the corner.
They're in the corner.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to. I'm just going to wheel in the wine at 4 o'clock. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'm just going to take questions. Hopefully we'll make sure that they cover all of the speakers in ways that we can see some of the how they draw on each other. And thank you, God, for doing that to your talk as well. So we've lost community cohesion, but have we got any more questions to start? And would you mind saying who you are when you ask questions? Well, we'll collect a few.
Yes, it's kind of a comment on the very interesting discussion about the exhibition. I just wondered to what extent, when you were researching it, you considered it not just an intellectual and an aesthetic endeavour as much as a logistical endeavour, and what part that played in it. And I guess the reason why I asked that is, as somebody who used to work at the British Museum and saw a lot of exhibitions come and go, every exhibition was as much logistical as anything else, and the things that you were describing happened for every exhibition that was ever put on, in that there was always arguments about a curatorial perspective, but then also every exhibition was the product of discussions of back and forth between curators, between conservationists who say, well, you can't have that painting because it's had too much light exposure. So a lot of the time, the things that were omitted weren't necessarily because it represents something wrong or something like that, but it's in Belfast, or it's had too much light exposure. And so all of these things were always created by a committee, if you like, and particularly 3 curators. I mean, any time we did work with 3 curators, you were always going to end up with something that was kind of messy, actually, and always a bit convoluted, because there were always strong personalities. And then you got the director, and then you got the people in the labs, and so I just wanted to put that out there, really.
Yeah, could you just say who you are?
Sorry, I'm Joe Crook, I'm volunteering manager within Careers and Student Employability here.
Thanks. Do you want to respond to that before we go on, because it's such a long point?
Sure, yeah. I definitely, thanks for your question. That wouldn't be something that we would exclude. And in fact, that's something that curators did mention. For example, when initially out of the conversations, they thought maybe we can do something joint with the Yale Center. But it turns out the Yale Center had such a big vision, and they in fact have so much British art that Tate Britain couldn't really keep up with it, so they decided to do something more micro. And in fact, they thought, why don't we in part frame the exhibit according to what we have in Britain? So they didn't order any, pay for anything to come from abroad. And that kind of framed the exhibit as well. So there's still those kind of logistical and instrumental decisions behind the scenes. Oftentimes it was kind of confusing for us as well, because David Brown, in his answer to us, when we asked, how come there's no art on the loss of empire? Any decolonizing art or anti-colonial art or critical art? And his answer was framed in a logistical question. He said, well, we lost empire so quickly there was no time to make art. So sometimes there is a logistical question, but then it also seemed to be a kind of framework for avoiding more difficult intellectual questions. And we followed that up with Alison Smith, who also said, empire ended so quickly, there wasn't time to make that kind of art. So, yes, logistics, you could probably, I'll let you take the floor.
I just think actually I think that's such a great point. I think for us, with that particular, in introducing that as a particular reason, or as a reason more like that they gave, that they offered. And it was so apparent in the kinds of answers that they were giving us about the reasons for why. In some ways, I think what they were trying to do was to kind of give us a sort of pat response to perhaps why the exhibit was critiqued for the kind of position and opposition it took. So I think what was interesting, and perhaps what we wanted to highlight more so, is not that we were taking that as face value, but just that these were the kinds of discourses or narratives that they were offering about the exhibit and how fragmented it was and how difficult it was. And therefore, this is the, rather than saying, in the end, this is what we're accepting. Yeah, but I think that's a great point.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, thank you. You have your hand up.
Yeah, my question is also fair than I was wondering, so the people you spoke to who had visited the museum, I was wondering, so some of them are more positive and some of them were more negative, and I was wondering if there would seem to be any pattern, or whether you had a chance to talk to them about where their opinions had come from about empire, or whether there were particular things that led them to the feelings that they had.
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, yeah, I'm Amy, I'm from Sussex.
I think actually one thing I did want to kind of clarify earlier is that when we talked about the responses and sort of position that as binary responses are not quite right? In the sense that one of the things we're trying to kind of work through is, and we talked about ambivalence, we talked about the kind of ambivalent responses, is, I think it would be better to say that the exhibit provided this really great access point for respondents, to kind of talk about these sort of wider issues, right? So, and that kind of conceptual, the lack of the conceptual distinction between the exhibit and artwork, the visual representations, and then empire and their thoughts on it. The exhibit then, again, it provided this really kind of great way of being able to introduce some of these larger issues and work through them. So, yeah, I would just say it's inaccurate to say that there were these clear-cut binary responses. In fact, I mean, what again was so interesting was the way in which people would say, oh, empire was terrible, but, or we thought that a way of introducing some of their idea of working through some of these issues would be to say, oh, this exhibit challenged some of the kind of politically correct views, of this and that. So, yeah, it's almost like these kind of discursive elements that allowed for them to then, express more honestly their views. I'm not sure if it answers the question, but just to say.
People, just to build on Helen, and it's kind of generated its own new project in that some people did come from interesting positions. In particular, people who themselves could count their parents as having been administrators in empire. And they were incredibly emotional about the meaning of empire and the exhibit. And there's kind of two opposing respondents, of one that was very defensive about why to be prideful about empire, and another one who seemed like he himself was a lawyer, but could just list off negative aspects of the empire just like that, almost like he had spent his lifetime working through what it means of his father having been in administration of empire. So, yeah, we've realized from that that's some kind of multi-generational interviews with people who are the grandchildren or children of administrators of empire, and how they work through the shame or lack of shame associated with that is potentially a fascinating project.
So one question from Georgia, and then I'll continue with Georgia.
Yes, hi, I'm Georgia from the University of East London. I had a question for Helen Kim, but then also for Nira Biancardi, which revolves around negotiations of belonging and empire. So because I saw the exhibition, and what struck me about, so I started with the exhibition. When I saw the exhibition, what struck me is the way in which the subjects of empire were presented in different rooms, as if they were kind of an addition. And then you had the last room when you had the post-colonial subject. You had Sonia Boyce, you had Hugh Locke, and some of the other ones who were problematizing empire as a major political statement. And they were in a way put at the end, not as part of the collection. So, and to me this raises interesting questions on the narratives of, in a way, negotiations or a dialogue or contestation of different narratives of what empire is, what belonging is. And I wanted them to in a way, to bring that to the Nira's presentation, because I found very interesting that you ended your presentation by saying where are we now in terms of contesting this kind of dominant narratives of belonging, but we don't, in a way, know what it means for, you know, the ones who feel they don't necessarily belong. And it might be relevant for Gandhi as well. So it's more about negotiations and contestations from the side of the ones who are non-dominant.
We'll answer very quickly because we're kind of monopolizing. We were very struck when we went to the exhibit as well that legacies of empire, the kind of burden of negotiating what is the legacy of empire was placed entirely on people who could trace their parentage with being formerly colonized. And we were very struck because as you walk through Tate Britain, there's all kinds of white British art where they're obviously working through empire. There's all kind of art on National Front, rise of punk movements, all these kinds of things. And we would ask the respondents, what do you make of that? And they would say, the white respondents will say, well, I guess that's something they have to work through, isn't it? You know. So I'll leave it there. I'll pass it on to you.
Actually, it's kind of continuation because before I kind of go back to Joe's question, because you said there was no introduction, but in the book of the exhibition, Paul Gilroy actually wrote the introduction, which for me was a very great puzzle about the whole place of Paul Gilroy's introduction, and also when you read it, it's kind of quite different from a lot of other things that he's written. But for me, this was kind of the counter-narrative of the narrative of the opening games of the Olympics, where diversity was celebrated without any reference to the empire. It just kind of parachuted together with the NHS, without kind of at all kind of relating to this kind of mythical past. And here they decided, and I think this is what Paul Gilroy's introduction means, finally they're daring to tackle it, but as you say, in an ambivalent and confused way, without any kind of signifier or rather a free-floating signifier without actually anchoring it with any kind of particular political discourse, which is a different way, but the same message as the opening games of the Olympic, kind of, let's say. And that brings me to what you were saying, Georgia, which I think is very much linked to what Gagi was saying, because first of all, just a clarification, when I talk about everyday bordering, I didn't mean that it is still in the border. The whole point of everyday bordering is the de- and re-territorialization of bordering into everyday lives, and in this sense, not just in terms of the bureaucracy, as you're talking about, but also into the privatized kind of sphere,
Kind of internalisation,
rather than
yes.
just kind of because there is kind of the whole examination of entitlement is also part of private employers, private tenants. I mean, it is kind of encompassing society in a way which was unimaginable. I mean, if Max Weber would have come to alive now, he wouldn't really understand what is going on in this sense. So I think this is a very important, but it is important what you said, that it goes beyond not only the migrants, but also the notion of citizenship status as access and entitlement to resources. And it goes back to actually my starting point of the importance of to analyze these things intersectionally. So my argument is, on the one hand, you have to add citizenship status to gender, race, class, etc. But at the same time, and I would agree with you that class, like citizenship status, maybe is now more plays more kind of front kind of gatekeepers to resources than even gender does, but at the same time, he just highlight how we cannot understand anything unless we have an intersectional analysis of what is. And I hope this kind of answered a little bit about this kind of negotiation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay, so my question's on the last presentation. So this concept of the discipline of disentitlement, the disciplines of disentitlement, I suppose my question is to do with, to what extent do you see this as a kind of systemic thing coming from neoliberalism, techno-capitalism, the combination of the two, and to what extent do you see it as a kind of more political, so austerity being a kind of more Tory vision or whatever, and are those two things contradictory in any way? And also, just to bring it back to British values, if we go back to that conception of Blair, and Blair was saying British values are what can make us British, and included in that kind of democratic values and so on, if Britishness is becoming this kind of systematic concept, which kind of is quite against human rights, quite against, how do you tie those things together? A bit complicated, sorry.
Well, first I'm going to say just this slightly cheeky thing, but I just wish to say it in a group, that I think if you're going to look at popular expressions of nationalism within Britain, they are quite celebratory of being anti-democratic, anti-human rights, anti-tolerance. It's like, put your finger, despite the rent, yeah, we hate Muslims, but that is, and I think Brexit is kind of, you can watch that every day, but I think the kind of everyday discourses of Britishness are, and I think that's not an accident. I think that's a kind of anti-elite giving the finger in a time of anti-politics, and I think that's quite a particular moment. But that's just, I'd just like to say that. I'm so happy to say it to someone. But, is it systemic or is it historical? And to what so I think that there are things which I'm really attracted by. I mean, I think neoliberalism is too big a term, but certainly the idea of capitalism, or a certain moment in capitalist development, and I think the whole idea that we've been pushing for some years to a moment of global capitalism, which actively hollows out the space of political life. I mean, I'm really very open to that because it seems to fit the spaces I work in and the spaces of other friends of mine. There's a kind of echo of it feels true. Whether that's enough to be decided on whether it's a systemic change, because I also think and I really include myself in this, all of those of us who try to mediate between local stories and meta stories, there's always a danger that every discovery is systemic, isn't it? Because how do you tell at what moment does the historically precise become systemic? So I don't want to make that decision, but I do think that austerity kind of cannibalises opportunities from something like the neoliberal moment or the techno-capitalist moment and then remakes them for slightly more localised discourse that institutes new policy which kind of piggybacks on tendencies that are already there. So you already have this depoliticising tendency. And there's crisis, and we must absolutely dismantle democracy and say it's technocrats can do it. You can kind of see that opportunism within those discourses. So I prefer to think of them as in that kind of dance of opportunity, which is really how I think events happen in the world, probably. I don't know if that's good enough.
Yeah, no, it's very good. Dance of opportunity, I like that.
Thank you. Sorry, you didn't.
Oh, sorry, I'm Alex Thomas, I'm a lecturer in the Language Centre.
Thanks. I'm going to ask Michael's question next. Just to warn you that the wine is probably going to be wheeled in at 4, so we'll just kind of carry on and let him come in and set up, but we won't let that stop us until it's set up.
Thanks. I'm Michael Skay from UEA. Can I have one for each of you? Is that allowed?
You said here it's about disentitlement, not about entitlement.
I'll keep them brief. Eric and Helen, the people you spoke to, were they all white, middle class English? And so can you just tell us a bit more about the background of your particular interviewees? Gargi, you spoke about national belonging, but talked a lot about state provision. And I just wonder whether culture was a feature of debates around entitlement and belonging. And Nira, I know you did mention England, but obviously it's seminars called Britishness and Belonging, but given devolution to regions, etc., do we need to think more carefully about where England and Englishness and belonging fits into all this? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, the interviews at the museum, we could only get interviews with white British. And the background wasn't kind of, as far as we could tell from David Brown, the general feature of the people who, the type of people who go to visit, many from, as he said, the shires who come into the city to visit, kind of upper middle class, professional backgrounds. But we're trying to break beyond that, so we're subsequently doing a series of interviews through just rolling interviews, talking to people who know non-white British people who have gone to the exhibit to try and see how that lines up with this general framework that we found.
What do you mean by culture?
Well, the idea around, this is my country, I get to say what goes on here. These are the things that are allowed to go on. These are the people that are allowed to do stuff, say stuff, worship, dress, etc., etc.
No, really I'm trying to start from a completely different place, because I think although there's an attempt to assert that by some people, part of the rage is about the inadequacy of that attempt, and that is not fitting how the actual goods, if there are goods of national belonging, are being distributed, whatever is being said by the elite. It doesn't matter for your sanctioning whether you support East Ham or East Enders. It doesn't matter for your capability for work assessment. Even if there are the same racialised disadvantage, there's no, in this moment of kind of rationing and disentitlement, the benefit of cultural belonging is a purely emotional one, and the disparity between emotional belonging and the reality of disentitlement, I think, is a moment of crisis and tension. Now, I don't know where that could go. I think it could certainly, sadly, go without us exiting Europe as one element of it. I certainly think it can go with different kinds of political alliance. I think some of those political alliances may be a different kind of conviviality, which is what I think is the other side of what Nira is saying. On the one hand, there's that intrusion into all arenas of life, but the kind of widespread bad faith towards state intervention as it overreaches itself creates different alliances in which, whether you're white West Ham or something else, is overridden by your shared dislike of immigration enforcement for ruining my evening or some other kind of thing. So I would like to think that at the very least we should not only think about those cultural discourses which have in reality been essential people at power debates for quite some time. I know they're still there, but I'd like to think, well look, there's some other stuff to talk about as well, but at least let's think that they don't define each other.
I'm not sure what to answer you, Michael, because our research has been only in England, or more specifically in London and in the border of Dover-Calais, so Dover. I think that in these two places, this sense of disentitlement and also the grievances of the local kind of working class and so on were quite strong. I suspect that probably outside the metropolis or kind of mixed towns, the economic, social, political dynamic is different because these issues are very much part of kind of assumed and concentrated in places where there are suspicions of the state of illegal migrants. Although it's a positive universal, it is very focused. For example, in London, we know that the bordering agency kind of focused their raids and so on 5 boroughs, which was supposedly where the highest kind of so-called illegal migrants or overstayers and so on. I think in Scotland the attitude, for example, or in Wales, the attitude to Europe would be very different and kind of very. So, how about the shires and what is going on there? I don't know, but because of the racialized nature of everyday bordering, I suppose it will be much less common than in the metropolis or other kind of mixed town. But I think this is, as they say, the place for further research. One potential focus in terms of outside is there is a whole policy now. If before, in the 1890s, there was a state policy, this is again the whole what is bureaucracy and what is privatized, of dispersal by the states to put them in all kind of hostels and all kind of thing. There are now policies to give to the, is it G4 or whatever, to buy houses in places where they are very kind of cheap and to force kind of migrants to sit there. So these are places which maybe there wasn't that much of a presence of non-English origin people there. So it's kind of maybe a crisis in being, and the whole development of everyday bordering there, I think, would be very interesting. But I'm not sure.
I just want to also quickly follow up. It's more narrow than I implied. From the curators to the respondents, it's almost exclusively white English, not white British, with the exception of one Scottish woman who's lived here for many years with an English partner. So that has its own dynamic.
I'm not sure if you mentioned how much it cost to get in to the exhibition at the beginning. Yeah, but it was quite pricey, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, £12.
Yeah.
The book is also very expensive. Yeah.
What about the conference? Was it the conference? Was it private?
Oh, yeah, the question for you.
Sorry?
The conference of the company, the
Yeah.
flyer? How was it oriented?
It was a 2-day affair, and one day was largely academic, or meant to be framed as academic, and the other day was more practitioners, artists. And in fact, that was a huge controversy on its own, and they've since decided not to include that in any of the adverts subsequently, because the second day in particular was so conflictual. And what you had was a lot of artists who were Britons of color who were expressing a lot of frustration about the reception of their art in the National Galleries, and were actually quite, had quite critical views of the way Tate Britain were trying to frame it from a neutral perspective. And they were saying, well, there was one phrase, you're the arbiter of empire, you're trying to sit, phrase which you can never really be. And so it was very, very conflictual. The former day was less conflictual. It was mainly white academics and took a more calm tone towards it. But it was so conflictual that they just kind of erased it from any publications.
Okay, thank you. We need to finish now. I really hope that you will all stay and follow up and talk with the so thank you very much for coming.
Second.
Kind of I do, but I don't remember where from. Where was that? Here?
For your graduation.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's right, I do remember. Are you, are you here now?
Yeah, I'm still here in London. Yeah.
Okay, but you out?
No. I just haven't been here because I missed it twice.
The seminars? Oh, yeah.
In the evening, so
Cool.
didn't make it.
No.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was to come, but I didn't know you were here.
Well, I just, no, brilliant, definitely. I just came through.
I knew once you were at City University, yeah? Then I emailed you, but maybe you went already, you gone, so you didn't reply the letter, or maybe somewhere.
I left at the end of, when did I leave? I left 2 years ago.
Okay.
So I'm in Sussex now.
Sussex, yeah?
Yeah.
So,
What did you email me about?
no, you were there, I was, submitting proposal, but rejected many times, yeah.
What's your book on?
It's based on my PhD,
Yeah.
but still, but now so I'm writing, yeah, I'm a